Quebec. Beautiful, interesting, visually exciting, and very French. And yet this was the scene of one of the most innovative and shortest battles in world history. The story of Major General James Wolfe's seizure of Quebec in 1759. Britain was again at war with France and had decided to extend the fight to the colonies. In 1758, as a brigadier general, Wolfe had been sent to capture the fort of Louisbourg in Cape Breton, which commanded the route to Quebec and Montreal. After this successful campaign, which incidentally included a young Captain Cook, Wolfe returned to England, seeking more glory. When the decision was made to send a fleet to take Quebec, Wolfe was the first to apply. He was only 32, a tall, feeble-looking man, but he had impressed Prime Minister Pitt, who promoted him to the rank of Major General, before, in early 1759, sending him across the Atlantic with a fleet of some 200 ships, including 27 frigates and sloops of war and 80 support ships, a quarter of the British Navy. Some 9,000 soldiers and 18,000 sailors were packed in under the most uncomfortable and unhealthy of conditions. After a long and draining sea crossing, the fleet entered the St. Lawrence River. Beacons were seen at regular intervals, which seemed to indicate warnings of the British arrival. The French did not imagine for a minute that a fleet would be able to navigate the narrow East Channel in front of Quebec, and as a result, they had failed to put cannon at the entrance. This enabled the fleet to arrive unscathed. The fort, known as the Citadel, under the command of Le Marquis de Montcalm, consisted of 5 regiments of French regulars and many men from the Canadian colonial militia, supported by 100 cannon. The fort was protected on all sides by steep slopes. Within days of Wolfe's arrival on l'Île d'Orléans, the French sent several fireships to attack the British fleet. The British, initially startled, were soon able to pull the boats away with grappling hooks. The French had set fire to their ships too early, and were most aggrieved that 2 million francs worth of ships had gone up in smoke for nothing. Wolfe's next plan was to move troops across the southern channel to Point de Levy. After weeks of skirmishes and attacks from native Indians, Wolfe again changed his approach and decided to make a frontal attack on the northern Beauport shore, with disastrous consequences. 443 men were cut down by musket fire as they tried unsuccessfully to scramble up the steep slopes. After 3 months of continued bombardment, it was now September. Soon ice would be forming in the river, and the fleet would be stuck until late spring. But Wolfe had one last plan, which would either work or not work. Either way, the war would be over. Wolfe had found out from French deserters that provisions boats were due to come down from Montreal on the ebb tide, and it might be possible to use this to confuse the French sentries. Wolfe got lucky, as the supply boats had been delayed and the French sentries had not been told. Troops packed into barges, each soldier with 36 rounds of shot and provisions for 2 days, waited for the order to move. It was a dark night with no moon. From their position upstream from Point de Levy, the transport craft drifted with the ebb tide towards the north shore. Suddenly a shout.
Qui vive?
For a moment no one spoke. Then a British officer replied in his best French,
Honce et vive le roi!
À quel régiment?
the sentry called.
De la Reine!
Was the response. The sentry seemed satisfied and the boats drifted by. Further downstream, another challenge. Provision boats, the English replied. And don't speak so loud or the English will hear us. All the time the tide was taking the boats further downstream, and they missed their intended landing place by some distance. However, a little after 4 a.m, The troops, remaining in silence, began to climb up a steep, narrow pathway. The soldiers stumbled and swore as they made their way up the cliff face. Eventually, 24 soldiers reached the top, finding a line of tents. It was not long before the camp became alive with musket fire and cries of terrified soldiers. The limited French force scattered. Meanwhile, British warships continued to pound the North Shore. By dawn, around 4,400 sweating soldiers had hauled themselves to the summit. The French were nowhere to be seen, which gave Wolfe ample time to prepare for his assault on the fort and give orders for his soldiers to march to within 3/4 of a mile of the walls of Quebec. Montcalm, with only 4,000 men, only half of which were regulars, decided to face the British before they had an opportunity to reinforce their position still further with cannon. By 9 a.m, the French lined up 500 yards in front of the city walls on the Plains of Abraham. Standing shoulder to shoulder, soldiers waited with fear or pleasure, excitement or dread, for the order to advance. French snipers began picking off British soldiers on their north flank, and indeed Wolfe caught a shot in his hand. The British lined up in 2 rows. The French were firing at will as they advanced, 500 yards, 100, 50. But the British line held, and not one soldier fired until the command was given. Holes in the line were simply closed up by soldiers shuffling sideways. Eventually the order was given. The rear rank fired in unison, and then stepped forward between the front line. What was the front line fired while the other line reloaded. This was the first time this style of fighting was ever used in warfare, and it cut the French lines into complete disarray. By 11 a.m, the battle was won. Many senior British officers were killed, including Wolfe, who had then been shot on 3 separate occasions. The defeated French gave the order to surrender. The siege was over, and the Union Jack again flew proudly over Quebec. One of Britain's most historic battles had come to an end. Britain's empire had begun.